Presidents are remembered for their triumphs, victory in war, bold speeches, historic reforms. But history is shaped just as much by their mistakes. From laws that silenced free speech, to wars built on lies, to decisions that left scars for generations, these blunders changed America forever. Some cost lives, some destroyed trust, and some nearly ended the nation itself. This isn't the story of glory. It's the story of failure, and how one wrong choice in the Oval Office can echo for centuries. Which mistake do you think left the deepest scar? The freedom of the press should not be restrained. That's what Americans believed when they wrote the First Amendment. But under John Adams, printers were thrown in jail for criticizing the president's weight or for daring to question his policies. It was one of the first great betrayals of liberty in American history. In the late 1790s, America was still a fragile young republic. The French Revolution had exploded into Europe, Britain and France were at war, and the United States, caught in the middle, was struggling to stay neutral. Adams, the nation's second president, faced mounting pressure as French warships seized American vessels in the newspapers screamed of French plots, and rumors of spies filled taverns. Many feared that the revolution's radical ideas would spill into American politics. Against this backdrop, Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. On paper, the laws were meant to protect the nation. They extended the waiting period for immigrants to become citizens, allowed the president to deport dangerous foreigners, and, most controversially, made it a crime to criticize the government. In practice, the Sedition Act silenced Adams's critics, mostly Democratic-Republican newspaper editors. One journalist was jailed simply for mocking Adams's rotundity. The backlash was immediate. Ordinary Americans saw it as an attack on the Bill of Rights. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison secretly drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, declaring that states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws, a radical idea that would resurface decades later in the secession crisis. Adams, who saw himself as protecting the country, had instead lit a firestorm over free speech and states' rights. The act split his Federalist Party and doomed his re-election. Jefferson swept into power in 1800, calling it a revolution at the ballot box. Adams's mistake wasn't just political. It set an early precedent that presidents could overreach in the name of national security. And it left a scar that shaped how Americans view free expression in times of crisis. But if Adams's mistake showed how laws can strangle liberty, his successor would prove that even a well-meaning policy could strangle the economy itself. Imagine an America where every port is silent. Ships rotting at the docks. Sailors jobless. Farmers unable to sell their crops. That was the reality of Jefferson's grand experiment, the Embargo Act. He thought it would bring peace. He ended up strangling his own economy. By the early 1800s, the young United States found itself squeezed between two giants, Napoleonic France and Great Britain. Both powers were locked in a brutal war, and neither respected America's claim of neutrality. British warships impressed thousands of American sailors, literally kidnapping them and forcing them into the Royal Navy, while the French seized U.S. merchant ships trading with Britain. Outraged Americans demanded a response. Some wanted war. But President Jefferson, a man of peace who had just shrunk the military to save money, feared that open conflict would destroy the fragile republic. Instead, Jefferson turned to what he called peaceful coercion. In December 1807, he pushed Congress to pass the Embargo Act, banning all American ships from trading with foreign nations. His gamble was bold. By cutting off food and raw materials, he hoped to starve Europe into respecting American rights without firing a shot. The result was an economic catastrophe. At home, imports plummeted from 108 million to just 22 million in a single year. Ships rotted at the docks, warehouses filled with unsold goods, and farmers couldn't sell their crops abroad. Tens of thousands of sailors lost work, and smuggling boomed, especially along the Canadian border. Furious merchants in New England cursed Jefferson's name, calling the embargo, "Oh, grab me," a bitter pun that spelled embargo backward. The embargo did little to hurt Britain or France, but it devastated Jefferson's own people. Even his supporters began to question his judgment. In 1809, just before leaving office, Jefferson quietly repealed the act, admitting it had failed. But the damage was done. Sectional tensions grew, trust in the federal government weakened, and America moved one step closer to the War of 1812. Jefferson had dreamed of keeping America safe through diplomacy and principle. Instead, he left behind angry merchants, a wounded economy, and a bitter lesson. Sometimes doing nothing is better than doing the wrong thing. If Jefferson's mistake crippled the economy, his successor, Andrew Jackson, would make a choice that crippled lives and left a trail of suffering written in blood. They called it the Trail of Tears. Children dying by the roadside. Families forced to march thousands of miles at gunpoint. This wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. Andrew Jackson entered the presidency as a war hero and a man of the frontier. He styled himself as the champion of the common man, but that phrase, in Jackson's mind, did not include Native Americans. White settlers, hungry for land to grow cotton in the South, saw native nations as obstacles standing in the way of profit and expansion. Jackson agreed. He believed removal was not only necessary, but humane, claiming it would save native people from extinction. In 1830, Jackson pushed Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, granting him power to negotiate the forced relocation of native nations to lands west of the Mississippi. Though presented as voluntary treaties, everyone knew the reality: pressure, coercion, and eventually the use of force. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Muskogee, and Seminole all faced the same fate. When the Cherokee fought removal in the courts, they won a landmark case, Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, in which Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that states had no authority over native lands. But Jackson refused to enforce the ruling. The infamous quote, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," may be apocryphal, but Jackson's defiance was real. Federal troops continued to prepare for removal. The human cost was staggering. The Choctaw were the first to be marched westward, trudging hundreds of miles through snow and mud. Thousands died of hunger, disease, and exhaustion. The Cherokee followed in 1838 after Jackson had left office, but under the policy he set in motion. About 16,000 men, women, and children were forced along what became known as the Trail of Tears, and at least 4,000 perished along the way. Survivors described it as a trail of death. Jackson's policy did more than destroy lives. It reshaped the South. The fertile lands seized from native nations were quickly transformed into vast cotton plantations, expanding slavery deeper into the American interior. What Jackson justified as progress left behind graves, grief, and a legacy of betrayal that native communities still remember today. But while Jackson's mistake tore apart communities, another president's failure would tear apart the nation itself by standing by as the Union unraveled. By the time Abraham Lincoln put his hand on the Bible in March 1861, 7 states had already left the Union. Why? Because President James Buchanan had done almost nothing to stop them. In the face of secession, he simply folded his hands. By 1860, America was a nation on edge. For decades, the question of slavery had divided North and South. Compromises patched the cracks, but never sealed them. When Abraham Lincoln, a Republican opposed to slavery's expansion, won the election of 1860, Southern leaders warned it was the final straw. In December, South Carolina seceded. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. The Union was collapsing before everyone's eyes. Sitting in the White House was President James Buchanan, a man often ranked among the worst presidents in history. Buchanan admitted that secession was illegal, but in the same breath insisted he had no constitutional power to stop it. His passivity created a dangerous vacuum. While Southern states seized federal forts, arsenals, and courthouses, Buchanan mostly stood by, hoping the crisis would resolve itself. There was one half-hearted attempt. In January 1861, Buchanan sent the merchant ship Star of the West to resupply Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Confederate guns fired on it, forcing it to retreat. Buchanan took no further action. His message to Congress was clear: only the next president could handle this disaster. By the time Lincoln took office in March 1861, 7 states had already seceded, a Confederate government had formed, and the Union's position was fatally weakened. Buchanan's refusal to act didn't cause the Civil War. Slavery and sectionalism had long paved that road, but his inaction ensured that Lincoln inherited a Union already in flames. Historians still debate whether Buchanan truly lacked authority or simply lacked courage. Either way, his presidency is remembered as a cautionary tale. Sometimes doing nothing in a crisis can be the gravest mistake of all. And while Buchanan's failure let the Union crumble, another president's stubbornness after victory abroad would leave America isolated and help set the stage for future wars. The war to end all wars. That's what Woodrow Wilson promised. But when peace finally came, America turned its back on his vision. Not because of his enemies, but because Wilson himself refused to compromise. The First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. By 1918, millions were dead, Europe lay in ruins, and people everywhere prayed that humanity would never repeat such a catastrophe. President Woodrow Wilson believed he had the answer. In January 1918, he laid out his famous 14 points, a blueprint for a new world order built on diplomacy, self-determination, and above all, collective security. At the heart of this vision was the League of Nations, an international body where countries would work together to prevent future wars. When the guns finally fell silent, Wilson sailed to Paris to negotiate the peace treaty himself, the first time a sitting U.S. president had traveled abroad in office. But the Versailles negotiations were messy. France and Britain wanted revenge and reparations from Germany. Wilson compromised on many of his ideals, but he held firm on the League. He saw it as essential, even if the rest of the treaty was flawed. Back home, however, Wilson ran into a wall. The U.S. Senate, led by Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, had deep reservations, especially about Article 10, which seemed to commit America to defend other nations in future conflicts. Senators feared this would drag the U.S. into endless foreign wars without Congress's approval. Lodge offered compromises, reservations that might allow the treaty to pass. But Wilson refused to bend. Convinced that history demanded pure principle, he launched a cross-country speaking tour to rally public support. It broke him. In September 1919, after weeks of relentless speeches, Wilson collapsed from exhaustion. Soon after, he suffered a massive stroke that left him incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. His wife, Edith Wilson, quietly took over many of his duties, a situation some historians call the first female presidency. Meanwhile, the Senate rejected the treaty. The United States never joined the League of Nations. Without American leadership, the League was fatally weakened. It failed to stop aggression in the 1930s, Japan in Manchuria, Italy in Ethiopia, and finally Hitler in Europe. Wilson had dreamed of permanent peace, but his refusal to compromise left America isolated and the world vulnerable. And while Wilson's mistake was one of pride and principle, the next great blunder came from fear that drove a president to make an economic decision that helped turn a recession into the Great Depression. A single law turned a stock market crash into a global depression. It was called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, and Herbert Hoover believed it would save jobs. Instead, it destroyed them. When Herbert Hoover entered the White House in 1929, he carried a reputation as a brilliant problem solver. The man who had organized relief for starving Europeans during World War I and overseen massive public works at home. Many Americans believed he would guide the nation through prosperity. But only months into his presidency, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression had begun. As panic spread, Hoover searched for ways to protect American jobs and industries. Farmers in particular were suffering. Crop prices had collapsed, and foreclosures were sweeping across the Midwest. Hoover and Congress thought they had a solution: raise tariffs on imported goods so Americans would buy more at home. The result was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, one of the highest protective tariffs in U.S. history. Instead of relief, it triggered disaster. Other nations retaliated with tariffs of their own, shutting U.S. exports out of foreign markets. Global trade plummeted by nearly 2/3 in just 3 years. American factories closed, farmers lost what little markets they had left, and unemployment soared above 20. Hoovervilles, shanty towns built from scraps, sprang up on the edges of cities as families lost their homes. Breadlines stretched around blocks. Hoover believed he was defending American workers, but his policy deepened their misery. Critics accused him of being out of touch, a man who urged rugged individualism, while millions went hungry. By 1932, the public had lost faith, and Hoover was swept out of office in a landslide by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Smoot-Hawley became a symbol of economic blindness, proof that even a well-meaning decision can unleash unintended consequences. The tariff wars helped turn a financial crisis into a global depression that reshaped the world. But Hoover's economic miscalculation was followed by Roosevelt's moral one, a decision made in fear after Pearl Harbor that left tens of thousands of innocent Americans behind barbed wire. They were American citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, children pledging allegiance in school. But after Pearl Harbor, their loyalty was questioned. And by FDR's order, 120,000 Japanese Americans were forced into camps behind barbed wire. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Overnight, the United States was thrust into World War II. But alongside the call to arms came a wave of fear. Politicians, generals, and ordinary citizens began to whisper, what if Japanese Americans were secretly loyal to Tokyo? President Franklin D. Roosevelt, already celebrated for his leadership through the Depression, now faced the pressure of total war. In February 1942, he signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the military to designate exclusion zones. In practice, this meant removing anyone of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. The logic was simple but cruel: relocate the entire population just in case. The human toll was staggering. Families had only days to sell homes, businesses, and possessions, usually at a fraction of their value. Around 120,000 people, 2/3 of them American citizens, were herded onto trains and buses, carrying only what they could pack. They were sent to remote camps behind barbed wire in deserts and swamps, guarded by soldiers with rifles. Entire communities vanished overnight. Daily life in the camps was harsh. Families lived in cramped wooden barracks with no insulation. Dust storms swept through. Food was rationed. Privacy was non-existent. Children pledged allegiance to the flag in makeshift schools while their parents wondered why their loyalty was doubted. Some young men volunteered to fight anyway, serving heroically in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most decorated units in U.S. history, even as their families remained imprisoned. In 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the government's actions in Korematsu v. United States, ruling that national security justified the exclusion. But on the same day, in Ex parte Indo, the court also held that loyal citizens could not be detained indefinitely. Camps began closing in 1945, but the damage was lasting. Homes lost, businesses destroyed, trust shattered. Decades later, the U.S. government would apologize and pay reparations. But for those who lived it, the memory never faded. Roosevelt had led the nation through its greatest trial. But in this moment, fear overcame principle, and liberty was sacrificed on the altar of security. And while Roosevelt's decision was driven by fear, the next great blunder came from overconfidence. A young president who thought he could topple a dictator in Cuba with a single bold strike, and instead nearly ignited a global catastrophe. 3 days. That's all it took for John F. Kennedy's invasion of Cuba to collapse in disaster. At the Bay of Pigs, his bold gamble humiliated America and brought the world one step closer to nuclear war. When John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, he was young, charismatic, and eager to prove himself on the world stage. But almost immediately, he inherited a secret plan from the Eisenhower administration, a CIA-backed invasion of Cuba. The goal was to overthrow Fidel Castro, the fiery revolutionary who had toppled Batista and aligned himself with the Soviet Union. The plan was bold, but deeply flawed. A brigade of Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, would land on Cuba's southern coast at a place called the Bay of Pigs. They were supposed to spark a popular uprising against Castro. U.S. airstrikes were meant to cripple Cuban defenses, while Washington denied any direct involvement. Kennedy was torn. He wanted to be tough on communism, but he feared exposing America's hand. In the end, he approved the invasion, but scaled back the crucial air support, worried it would make U.S. involvement too obvious. The result was a disaster. On April 17, 1961, the exiles hit the beaches. Instead of a welcoming uprising, they found Castro's forces waiting. Without promised U.S. air cover, they were quickly surrounded. After 3 days of fighting, more than 100 were dead and over 1,000 captured. Televised images of the debacle humiliated the United States. The consequences were enormous. Castro emerged stronger than ever, boasting that he had crushed American imperialism. The Soviet Union drew closer to Cuba, eventually placing nuclear missiles on the island. Just a year later, Kennedy faced the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. 13 days in which the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy admitted the Bay of Pigs was a mistake, but privately, it hardened him. Determined never to appear weak again, he became more aggressive toward the Soviets, setting the stage for escalating Cold War tensions. His miscalculation in Cuba showed how one botched gamble could change the balance of global power. And while Kennedy's blunder nearly triggered World War III, his successor would plunge America into a war that dragged on for a decade, cost tens of thousands of lives, and shattered trust in government at home. It began with a murky report from the Gulf of Tonkin, an attack that may never have happened. From that shaky foundation, Lyndon Johnson escalated America into its longest and most divisive war. Lyndon B. Johnson entered the presidency after the shock of John Kennedy's assassination. A master of Congress and a champion of civil rights, Johnson dreamed of building a great society, eradicating poverty, expanding healthcare, and pushing for racial equality. But his domestic vision collided with a foreign war that would consume his presidency. Vietnam was already a simmering conflict. The U.S. had been supporting South Vietnam against communist North Vietnam for years, but in 1964, events took a dramatic turn. Reports came in of U.S. destroyers attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. The second attack on August 4th was later revealed to be exaggerated, if not entirely false, but Johnson seized the moment. He pressed Congress for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving him sweeping authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. With that blank check, escalation began. By 1965, U.S. troops were on the ground in massive numbers. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam. Johnson and his advisors believed overwhelming force could break the enemy's will. Instead, The war became a bloody stalemate. American forces won battles but lost the political war as images of burning villages, body bags, and the use of napalm filled television screens back home. The cost was staggering. Over 58,000 Americans killed, hundreds of thousands wounded, and millions of Vietnamese dead. At home, protests erupted on college campuses, draft cards were burned, and the credibility of government itself began to crumble. Johnson, once beloved for his civil rights triumphs, was now reviled as the architect of a senseless war. By March 1968, with his presidency consumed by the conflict, he shocked the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election. The Vietnam War left scars that have never fully healed. It shattered public trust, divided generations, and taught Americans a bitter lesson about the limits of military power. Johnson had dreamed of being remembered as the president who built the Great Society. Instead, he became the president who lost America's faith. And if Vietnam destroyed Johnson's legacy, the next great blunder would destroy a presidency itself, an abuse of power so shocking it forced the only resignation in American history. I'm not a crook. Richard Nixon's infamous defense. But the tapes told a different story, one of lies, cover-ups, and the only presidential resignation in American history. Richard Nixon rose to power as a shrewd, relentless politician. By 1972, he was riding high, opening relations with China, easing tensions with the Soviet Union, and cruising toward re-election. But behind the scenes, Nixon was consumed by paranoia. He saw enemies everywhere, political opponents, the press, even his own government agencies. That fear drove him to a mistake that would end his presidency in disgrace. In June 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. They weren't common burglars. They were tied to Nixon's re-election campaign, the committee to re-elect the president. At first, the story seemed minor. Nixon himself denied involvement. But over time, reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, uncovered a web of political espionage, wiretaps, and hush money stretching straight back to the White House. Nixon's mistake wasn't just the burglary. It was the cover-up. He ordered aides to obstruct the FBI investigation, destroy evidence, and silence witnesses with cash. But Nixon had also been secretly taping conversations in the Oval Office. Those tapes became his undoing. When investigators subpoenaed them, Nixon resisted, insisting executive privilege gave him the right to keep them hidden. The battle went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously that he had to hand them over. The smoking gun tape revealed Nixon ordering the CIA to block the FBI investigation. The scandal exploded. Facing certain impeachment and removal, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, the first and only U.S. president to do so. Watergate shattered Americans' faith in their leaders. It introduced a new era of skepticism toward government, fueled demands for transparency, and gave the suffix "gate" to every scandal that followed. Nixon had sought to control power at all costs, but in doing so, he lost it all and forever changed the way Americans view the president. And while Nixon's downfall destroyed trust at home, decades later another president would make a decision abroad that reshaped the entire Middle East, igniting chaos that still burns today. Weapons of mass destruction. That was the justification. But when the dust settled in Iraq, none were found. Instead, George W. Bush had unleashed chaos that would haunt the Middle East for decades. The September 11th attacks in 2001 changed everything. Nearly 3,000 Americans were killed, the Twin Towers fell, and the nation was gripped by fear and fury. President George W. Bush vowed to hunt down terrorists wherever they hid. First came Afghanistan, where U.S. forces toppled the Taliban for sheltering Osama bin Laden. But soon, the Bush administration turned its gaze elsewhere, to Iraq. For years, Saddam Hussein, Iraq's dictator, had been a thorn in America's side. He had used chemical weapons in the past and defied United Nations inspectors. The Bush administration argued he was hiding weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and could supply them to terrorists. Officials warned of mushroom clouds if America failed to act. In March 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq with the support of a coalition of the willing, confident the war would be swift. At first, it seemed a success. Baghdad fell within weeks. Saddam was captured. Bush even declared victory under a mission accomplished banner. But the real war was only beginning. No stockpiles of WMDs were ever found. Instead, Iraq descended into chaos. Sectarian violence exploded between Sunni and Shia factions. Insurgents waged guerrilla warfare against U.S. troops. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, an organization that hadn't existed before the invasion, took root, later evolving into ISIS. The cost was staggering. Over 4,000 American soldiers were killed, tens of thousands wounded, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died in the violence. The war cost trillions of dollars and destabilized the Middle East for a generation. The promise of a quick victory gave way to years of occupation, torture scandals like Abu Ghraib, and a bitter debate at home over what had gone wrong. Bush believed he was protecting America from another 9/11. Instead, the Iraq War is remembered as one of the greatest strategic blunders in U.S. history, a war launched on faulty intelligence that unleashed consequences still felt today. But Bush was hardly the first president to gamble everything on war and lose. Nearly 2 centuries earlier, another leader's bold gamble had backfired so badly that the British Army marched into Washington and set the White House itself. From Adams to Bush, every president's misstep has left its mark. Some mistakes crushed liberty. Others drained treasure. And some cost countless lives. But all of them remind us of a sobering truth. Even the most powerful office in the world is still held by a fallible human being. History doesn't just remember victories, it remembers blunders. So tell me, which of these presidential mistakes do you think changed America the most? Or did I leave one out that deserves the spotlight? If you want more untold stories of history's greatest blunders, hit subscribe and join us for the next chapter.